By the last week of February, 1943, the German command in Tunisia had reached a comfortable conclusion about the American soldier. He was well-fed and well-equipped, with more trucks than sense, and more artillery than experience. And when the shooting got close and personal, the consensus held, he would not stand. This was not propaganda, meant for the folks back home. It was the considered professional opinion of men who had just spent a week taking American positions apart at a mountain pass called Kasserine. They had watched green United States divisions buckle and scatter. They had captured American tanks by the dozen and American prisoners by the thousand. The reports going back up the German chain of command were confident and specific. The Americans fought a rich man's war from a safe distance, and the moment you closed that distance, they folded. It would turn out to be one of the worst professional predictions any army made in the entire war. Within a single month, the same German armor that had rolled over the Americans at Kasserine would attack American positions again, at a dusty road junction called Guettar, and it would be stopped, shot apart, and thrown back by the very soldiers the German staff had written off as soft. The man who arranged that reversal had been in command of those soldiers for barely 2 weeks. He wore ivory grips on his revolvers. He fined his own men for failing to wear neckties in a combat zone. And he held a particular theory about courage that he was about to test on the 10th Panzer Division, in person, at close range. This is the story of what George Patton actually did, about the idea that Americans could not fight. Not a clever sentence delivered across a polished table. Something slower, colder, and a great deal more expensive for the people who believed it. If you enjoy stories where arrogance runs straight into arithmetic, this channel was built for you. Take a moment to subscribe and switch on the notification bell, because the way this one turns is worth being here for. To understand why the German verdict felt so reasonable in the winter of 1943, you have to understand how badly the Americans had just performed, and how new to the whole business they really were. The United States had been fighting the German army on the ground for roughly 3 months. American troops had come ashore in North Africa the previous November, in Operation Torch, in 3 great landings spread along the coast from Casablanca to Algiers, and most of them had never heard a shot fired in anger. They had trained in Louisiana, and the Carolinas, and the deserts of California. But training is a rehearsal, and Tunisia was opening night against the most experienced ground army on the planet. The Germans facing them had been at war since 1939. Many of the men in the Africa Corps had spent 2 years learning desert warfare against the British, an education no maneuver in Louisiana could match. The Americans, by contrast, were carrying brand new equipment, brand new commissions, and a confidence that had not yet been tested by anyone shooting back. Whole divisions had been raised from almost nothing, trained at speed, shipped across an ocean, and fed into a real battle, all without their officers ever once having to make a hard decision with men dying around them. The factories at home were already beginning to bury the enemy in materiel, and the soldiers arrived with more trucks, more fuel, and more shells than the Germans had seen on most fronts, which only sharpened the contempt, because to a hard veteran, a rich amateur is still an amateur. Tunisia itself did the newcomers no favors. The country in winter was a wretched place to learn your trade, a jumble of bare mountains, deep mud, freezing nights, and long open valleys that handed every advantage to whoever owned the air and the artillery, which in early 1943 meant the Germans. The Allies had landed back in November, hoping to sprint east and grab the ports of Tunis and Bizerte before the Germans could rush in reinforcements, and they had lost that race by a hair. While the Allied columns slogged east through the rain, the Germans flew and shipped troops into Tunisia at a furious pace, building a hard bridgehead around the ports faster than anyone on the Allied side had believed possible. The winter rains turned the roads to grease. The advance stalled short of the prize, and the campaign sank into a grinding stalemate along a ragged front. The Green American Second Corps held the southern end of that line, stretched thin across ground nobody fully understood yet, and it was into that exposed, overstretched flank that the Germans decided to swing their fist. The American command in Tunisia made a hard situation worse. The main American formation in the line was the Second Corps, and it was led by a major general named Lloyd Fredendall, a man whose reputation grew more unfortunate the closer you looked at it. Fredendall disliked leaving his headquarters. He referred to units by private nicknames, and gave orders in a homemade code that his own staff officers struggled to decipher. so that even a clear instruction could arrive at the front, sounding like a riddle. He distrusted his own subordinate commanders, and went around them, reaching down to move individual units himself, from miles away, without bothering to tell the men actually responsible for them. Most memorably, he ordered his engineers to blast an enormous command bunker into a mountainside far behind the fighting, a project that ate up equipment and labor for days. While the infantry up front were short of mines and barbed wire, the engineers were drilling a deep, comfortable shelter for a general who showed no intention of going anywhere near the enemy. The bunker became a quiet embarrassment inside the American command, long before the Germans ever bothered to test the line. So the picture, by the middle of February, was not encouraging. The line was thin, the units were spread across far too much ground, the leadership was distant and confusing. The soldiers were brave but completely inexperienced, and they were about to meet professionals. Everything that can go wrong with an army walking into its first real battle was going wrong at once, and almost none of it was the fault of the men who would do the bleeding. The Germans saw all of it, and they decided to attack. The blow fell first around a position called certain.Ze. American armor was committed there in penny packets, a battalion here and a battalion there, instead of concentrated, and the Germans destroyed it piece by piece. 2 American infantry battalions had been pushed forward onto a pair of bare hills out in front of certain.Ze, perched like watchmen on rock, with no real way to support one another. And when the German armor rolled through and around them, they were simply cut off and left behind. The orders that reached them were a study in wishful thinking. Hold. Then wait for relief that was not coming. Then, finally, try to slip out on foot, across miles of open desert under the enemy's guns. From their hilltops, the trapped men could watch the German columns flow past below them, out of reach, rolling on toward the rear. And there was nothing to do but wait for an end that came in one of 2 forms. Most of them never made it back. They were killed or captured almost to a man. An entire forward garrison swallowed in a couple of days because the dispositions had been hopeful from the start, and the enemy had been ruthless. When a relief force of American tanks was sent in to recover the situation, it was ordered straight across open ground, in full view of waiting German guns and panzers, and it was shot to pieces in the open. The German gunners let the American armor come well inside range, then opened up from the front and the flank at once, and in the space of a single afternoon, a large part of an American armored command was turned into burning hulks, scattered across the desert. Crews who lived through it walked back across the desert on foot, leaving their burning tanks behind them. Within a few days, the Germans had pushed on through the Kasserine Pass itself, and the American defense came apart at the seams. Green troops met massed German armor and air attack for the first time, and the experience was every bit as terrifying as the veterans had always warned it would be. Units lost contact with their neighbors, and with their own headquarters. Some men fought hard in isolated pockets and held until they were overrun. Many simply fell back, sometimes in good order and sometimes not, along roads jammed with vehicles, wounded men, and rumor, which travels faster than either. What finally stopped the Germans was not a sudden recovery by the broken units, but a hard scramble of reinforcement, and a quarrel inside the German command itself. American and British gunners were rushed toward the threatened passes, including the artillery of an American division that made a brutal forced march of hundreds of miles in a matter of days to get its guns into the line. And behind a wall of massed shell fire, the defense at last began to firm up. At the same time, the German effort was pulling in 2 directions. Rommel wanted to drive deep, to lunge at the supply dumps in the American rear, and turn a local success into something decisive. Others in the German command preferred a shorter, safer thrust. The 2 impulses worked against each other. The offensive lost its focus at the worst possible moment, and Rommel, looking at lengthening odds and stiffening resistance, chose to break it off and pull back the way he had come. The Germans gave up most of the ground they had taken, but they kept their conclusion about the Americans, and that conclusion was the truly dangerous thing they carried home from Kasserine. By the time the German offensive ran out of fuel and momentum, the Americans had lost thousands of men killed, wounded, and captured, along with hundreds of tanks, half-tracks, guns, and trucks. It was the most humiliating performance the United States Army gave against Germany in the entire war, and it happened in the very first serious meeting between the 2 armies. The Germans, naturally, drew a lesson from it. The lesson they drew was the wrong one. They concluded that the failure was a failure of the men. The American private, in their reading, simply lacked the hardness, the stubbornness, the plain willingness to die in place, that the German and the British soldier had shown again and again across 2 years of desert fighting. It was an easy conclusion to reach, because it flattered everything the German army already believed about itself. 2 years of victories in the desert had convinced them they were the finest soldiers alive, and the doctrine handed down from above told them their enemies were lesser peoples who would crack the moment real pressure was applied. Kasserine looked like proof of both at once. This is the judgment that sits underneath the polite phrase in the title of this video. When a professional soldier tells you the enemy will not stand, he is telling you the enemy lacks courage. That was the German verdict on the United States Army in early 1943, and it was delivered with the supreme confidence of men who had just watched it appear to be true with their own eyes. It was not true. And the reason it was not true is the whole hinge of this story, so it is worth being precise about it. The American soldier at Kasserine was not a coward. He was an apprentice, thrown into a master craftsman's shop with dull tools and a foreman hiding in a hole in the ground. The thing that broke at Kasserine was not the courage of the man holding the rifle. It was everything stacked above him. The dispersion of the units, the confusion of the orders, the inexperience of the officers, who were learning their trade in real time against people who had already mastered theirs, and the absence of a commander who believed the fight could be won and could make his soldiers believe it too. Fix all of that, and the same men become a completely different army. Nobody on the German side seriously considered that possibility, because their entire doctrine of racial and martial superiority told them the enemy's weakness lived in his blood, not in his circumstances. That was a comfortable belief to hold. As a method of predicting your enemy, it was very close to suicidal, and the Germans would spend the rest of the war discovering exactly how close. It is worth saying plainly that even in the disaster, plenty of Americans had fought hard. There were gun crews who stayed at their pieces firing over open sights until they were overrun, tank crews who drove into hopeless odds because those were the orders they had been given, and isolated pockets that bought time for everyone behind them with their own lives. The collapse was real, but it was a collapse of organization, more than a collapse of nerve. The particular kind that happens when brave men are committed in the wrong places, in the wrong strength, under commanders who cannot see the battle they are supposedly directing. The Germans, glancing at the broad result, saw cowards. A closer look would have shown them something far more threatening, an enemy whose courage was already present and accounted for, and only needed to be organized. Organizing it was about to become one man's job. The man the United States Army sent to fix the leadership problem arrived on the 6th of March 1943, in a cloud of dust, a scream of sirens, and a level of personal theater the Desert War had not yet witnessed. George Smith Patton was 57 years old, and he had spent his whole adult life preparing for a war that, until very recently, he had been genuinely afraid he might miss. He came from money, and from a family steeped in soldiering. He had competed in the modern pentathlon at the Stockholm Olympics in 1912 and finished a respectable 5th. He had chased the Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa across the border in 1916, and during that expedition, he led a small motorized raid in automobiles, gunned down one of Villa's officers and 2 other men, and then strapped the bodies to the hoods of the cars and drove them back to camp, which got him noticed by his superiors and gives you a fairly complete sense of the man at 30. In the First World War, he organized and led the 1st American Tank Brigade, learned the new machines from the ground up, and was shot through the upper leg, leading them forward on foot in the Meuse-Argonne. Between the 2 wars, when the tank was an unfashionable idea and the cavalry to a lot of senior officers still meant horses, Patton kept thinking about armor, speed, and shock, and kept getting ready for a war most people hoped would never come. He also cultivated a public personality so loud and so deliberately abrasive that it was easy to mistake him for a blowhard, and plenty of people did. That was a mistake. Underneath the profanity and the ivory grips was one of the most serious students of war the American Army produced in the entire 20th century. Patton read history constantly, in several languages, and he believed something about that history with total conviction. He believed it so completely that he was privately certain he had lived through some of it himself, in earlier lives, as a soldier in older armies, and he wrote poetry about marching with ancient legions. You can file that wherever you like. The point is that the loud, swaggering general was, underneath the act, a man who took the craft of war more seriously than almost anyone around him, and who had concluded that battles are won in the minds of soldiers before they are ever won on the ground. When he took over the beaten Second Corps, he acted on that conclusion immediately, and without a shred of mercy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first thing the soldiers of the Second Corps noticed about their new commander was that he cared, intensely and personally, about their neckties. This sounds like a punchline, and the men certainly received it as one at first, but Patton was deadly serious. He issued orders that every soldier, at all times, in the rear areas and up near the front, would wear a helmet, a necktie, leggings, and a complete uniform. He set fines for violations, and then he actually enforced them, which was the part nobody could quite believe. Cooks were fined, clerks were fined, truck drivers were fined. Men coming off the line filthy and hollow-eyed found that the new general had inspectors checking whether their chin straps were fastened. The grumbling was immediate, loud, and entirely understandable. To soldiers who had just survived a beating in the desert, being docked pay over a missing necktie felt like an insult laid carefully on top of an injury. Patton did not care in the slightest that they hated it, because the necktie was never about the necktie. He understood a thing about defeated troops that Fredendall had never grasped in his bunker. A beaten army stops believing in itself, and a soldier who has stopped believing stops doing the small, hard, unglamorous things that keep him breathing, like digging his hole deep enough, posting his guard, and obeying an order the instant it lands instead of a fatal few seconds later. Patton's theory was that you rebuild belief from the outside inward. You make a man look like a soldier, and act like a soldier, and submit to the discipline of a soldier. And somewhere in that grinding daily process he starts, almost against his will, to feel like one again. The neckties and the chin straps and the fines were 1,000 tiny demands that all added up to a single message, repeated every hour of every day. You are not a defeated rabble. You are the Second Corps of the United States Army, and you are going to start carrying yourselves that way whether you feel like it or not. He backed the petty discipline with relentless personal visibility, which was the other half of the cure. Where Fredendall had hidden, Patton was everywhere, roaring up to forward positions in an open vehicle, standing where every man could see him, swearing at them, and praising them, and frightening them in roughly equal measure. He wanted to become a presence, a story, a personality so enormous that the soldiers would carry it into battle in their heads. The revolvers were part of that calculation. He wore a pair of single-action revolvers with grips made of ivory, and he was famously particular about the distinction. When a reporter once called them pearl-handled, Patton corrected him with a line that has outlived almost everything else said in Tunisia. Only a pimp in a cheap New Orleans house, he said, would carry a pearl-handled pistol. His were ivory. The material was not really the issue. The issue was that the commanding general had decided, on purpose and with great care, to be impossible to forget. Behind the show there was hard, unglamorous substance, which is the part the neckties tend to hide. Patton did not only inspect chin straps. He went through the officer corps of the Second Corps and removed the men he judged unfit, swapping out tired or timid commanders for people who would push. He pulled the units back into proper concentration, instead of leaving them strewn across the map for the enemy to pick off one at a time. He saw to it that the soldiers got hot food, regular mail, and the small reliable comforts that quietly tell a man somebody competent is now running his life. He drove the supply trains and the staff work as mercilessly as he drove the discipline, because he understood that aggression without logistics is just an efficient way to get your men killed, somewhere they cannot be resupplied. The swagger was genuine, but it sat on top of a foundation of grim professional competence, and the soldiers, who can always feel the difference, noticed the floor under their feet stop shifting. He was not doing any of this alone. His deputy was a quiet, plain-spoken major general named Omar Bradley, a man who was Patton's opposite in nearly every way that showed, and his equal in the ways that counted. Where Patton was performance, Bradley was arithmetic, careful and methodical, and trusted by the soldiers precisely because he never once tried to dazzle them. The two men did not love each other, and history would knot their careers together in ways that turned genuinely bitter later on. But in the spring of 1943, they made an effective pairing. Patton supplied the fire and the fear. Bradley supplied the steady professional competence that turned the fire into a workable plan. Above them both stood Dwight Eisenhower, an old friend of Patton's from the lean interwar years, when the two of them had argued about tanks together. And it was Eisenhower who had reached down, relieved Fredendall, and handed the wreckage of the Second Corps to the one general he trusted to set it on fire in the right direction. Fredendall, for what it is worth, did not exactly suffer for the disaster. He was quietly shipped home to the United States, given a training command, and in time, promoted to lieutenant general, which tells you something dry and unflattering about how careers sometimes work. He spent the rest of the war teaching, far from anyone he could lose. The men he had left scattered in the Tunisian hills got Patton instead. In a matter of weeks, the change in the Second Corps was visible to everybody who saw it, and eventually that included the Germans. The men were cleaner, sharper, and a good deal angrier than they had been. The slackness was gone. Patton had not handed them new tanks or rebuilt their training from scratch in any deep sense. What he had given them back was the belief that they were a real army, and he had done it by being such an overwhelming, exhausting, profane force of nature that the soldiers had no room left over to feel sorry for themselves. Whether they admired him or wanted to strangle him, and plenty wanted to strangle him, they had stopped behaving like men who expected to lose. The test of whether any of it had worked came at the end of March, at a place called Guettar. If you are still with us this far in, do us a favor and tap the like button. It genuinely helps these longer history pieces reach the people who care about them. And while you are at it, drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Guettar was a town in southern Tunisia, sitting near a junction of roads that the Allies needed to use, and the Germans wanted to deny them. In the third week of March, Patton's Second Corps pushed into the area, took the town, and dug in among the dry hills and broken ground beyond it. Holding the high ground around the pass was the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One of the most experienced formations the Americans had, stiffened by anti-tank units and artillery dug carefully into the slopes with good observation over the approaches. This was not a thin screen strung carelessly across open desert. This was a position chosen and prepared by men who intended to stay. The German command decided to throw the Americans straight back out, and to do it, they reached for the same tool that had worked so well a month earlier. They sent in the 10th Panzer Division, a veteran armored formation, the same breed of force that had helped shatter the American line at Kasserine. The plan was simple, and it rested directly on the verdict the Germans had already reached about American character. Hit them hard with massed armor, and they would do exactly what they had done before. They would come apart, and the road junction would be German again by nightfall. On the morning of the 23rd of March, the German tanks came on across the open ground toward the American hills, and for a short while, it looked as though Kasserine was about to repeat itself. The armor advanced in strength. The dust rose in long brown banners. The pressure on the forward American troops was real and immediate, and a less steady defense might well have started to peel backward right there, which is precisely what the German plan was counting on. Then the ground the Germans were driving into began to kill them. This time the Americans were not scattered, and they were not surprised, and the man in command had not the slightest intention of falling back. The 1st Infantry Division held its high ground and its nerve. American artillery, handled far better than it had been a month before, ranged onto the advancing armor and began to break the attack up from a distance, smashing the careful formation into something ragged and confused before it ever closed the gap. As the German tanks pressed on into the low ground, they ran into the thing the verdict had never accounted for. American anti-tank guns and tank destroyer crews, sighted with real care, hidden, holding their fire with discipline, and then firing at short range into the flanks of the armor as it rolled past them. The German tanks found themselves in a killing ground, taking fire from the front and from both sides at once. With American infantry, they could not shift, sitting on the heights above them, and pouring down everything they had. The attack stalled. Then it failed. German tanks burned across the valley floor, sending up columns of black smoke that could be read for miles as exactly what they were. The 10th Panzer Division, the same division that had been part of breaking the Americans only weeks earlier, was stopped where it stood, lost a painful number of its tanks, and was thrown back the way it had come. The Germans regrouped and tried again later in the day, and the second attack met the same dug-in, well-handled, unbroken defense, and came apart against it just as the first one had. By evening, the Americans held every yard of ground they had started the morning with, and the valley in front of their positions was littered with the wreckage of an armored division that had been confidently informed the men on those hills would run. The Germans were not quite finished. Some days later they came back at the Guettar positions again, armor and infantry together, probing for a soft place in the American line. And again, they were met by prepared defenses, alert gunners, and infantry that would not give way. And again, they were thrown back with little to show for it, but more burning vehicles. There is an honest footnote owed here, because the American defense was not flawless. The young tank destroyer crews, fighting under a brand new doctrine that asked thin-skinned vehicles to rush out and trade shots with enemy tanks, took painful losses doing precisely what that doctrine told them to do. And the army would spend the next year quietly admitting the idea had been half wrong and rebuilding how those units fought. But the core lesson held, and it could not be argued with. Well-sighted guns, well-handled artillery, and stubborn infantry on good ground had broken a veteran Panzer Division, and then broken its follow-up attacks. The defense had worked, and it had worked against the best the enemy could throw at it. It was the first time in the war that American troops had met a major German armored attack, head-on, and beaten it into the ground. The count of destroyed tanks mattered, and it was a real and bitter loss for the Germans. But the bigger thing that died in that valley was the verdict itself. The Americans had stood. They had done a great deal more than stand. They had chosen their ground, laid a trap, sprung it, and wrecked a veteran Panzer Division in front of their own positions. The same soldiers, only weeks removed from the worst humiliation the army had suffered, had done the exact thing the German staff had so confidently declared they were incapable of doing. The men who were actually on the German side, in the dust and the smoke rather than at a desk in the rear, understood what had happened faster than the staff officers writing assessments far away. Rommel, the most respected commander the Germans had in Africa, had already started to revise his private opinion of the Americans, and his real view was a good deal more careful and more dangerous to his own side than the comfortable contempt floating around him. He had seen something the doctrine could not admit. The Americans learned with frightening speed. The British had taken years to become the army that fought in the desert. The Americans were compressing that same brutal education into months, and behind them sat a bottomless capacity to replace every tank, every gun, and every man they lost, and then send more. An enemy who learns that fast and produces that much is not an enemy you defeat by assuming he is a coward. He is an enemy you had better start taking with deadly seriousness. And by the time Guettar was burning, it was already getting very late to begin. For the American soldiers, the real change was not measured in tank kills or captured ground. It was something quieter, and far more important. They had been beaten badly, told in 100 ways that they were not good enough, and then, with the same hands and the same rifles, they had stood their ground and wrecked the people who had beaten them. A unit that has done that once knows it can do it again. And that knowledge is worth more than any quantity of new equipment. The fear of the Germans that had crept into the Second Corps after Kasserine, the sense that these were supermen who simply could not be stopped, died in the valley at Guettar alongside their armor. The Americans had taken the measure of the enemy and found him mortal. The rest of the war would be long and terrible. But the men who climbed down off those hills were not the men who had run a month earlier, and they knew it. And so, more slowly, and far more reluctantly, did the enemy. Rommel himself left Africa that same month, worn down and recalled, and command of the doomed Axis position in Tunisia passed to others. The end came in May. The army the Germans had dismissed as soft, fighting alongside the British, closed the trap on the entire Axis force in Tunisia, and more than 200,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity. The ports the Allies had failed to grab in the rainy scramble of the previous autumn, Tunis and Bizerte, fell in the first week of May, and the German commander who had inherited the ruin from Rommel surrendered the remnants of an army that had been assured, only weeks before, that it was facing soldiers too soft to fight. It was a catastrophe on the scale of a Stalingrad, inflicted in part by the very Americans whose courage had been so freely doubted in February. The verdict had not merely been wrong. It had been wrong in a way that helped lose an army. Patton did not stay to enjoy the reputation he had just rebuilt. Within weeks of Guettar, he handed the Second Corps over to Bradley, and was pulled away to plan the next operation, the invasion of Sicily that summer. where his hunger for speed and ground would carry him into both triumph and disaster. Sicily showed both sides of him at once. Landed alongside the British, and quietly furious at being cast as second fiddle to Bernard Montgomery, Patton turned the campaign into a foot race and threw his army across the island at a tearing pace, using small amphibious hooks along the coast to leap ahead of the retreating enemy, and he drove into the port of Messina just ahead of the British, which delighted him and annoyed nearly everyone above him. It was vintage Patton, brilliant and aggressive and more than a little about his own glory. And here the honest version of this story has to slow down, because the next thing Patton did is the part the legend prefers to skip, and it goes straight to the heart of the courage that this whole story is about. In Sicily, in the August of 1943, moving between field hospitals behind the front, Patton came across two soldiers in succession, on two separate days about a week apart, who had been taken off the line, not with visible wounds, but with what the war then called battle fatigue, and what we would now recognize as the psychological collapse that hard combat produces in ordinary men. Patton, who had built his entire creed on aggression and will, looked at these two shaking soldiers and saw cowards. He cursed them, he called them names, and in each case he struck them, slapping men who were patients in a hospital bed, in front of the doctors and the nurses, and the genuinely wounded lying all around them. One of them, it later turned out, was running a high fever from malaria. The man who had understood so clearly at Kasserine that the failure of beaten troops is a failure of leadership rather than nerve, had just brutally, publicly failed to extend that same understanding to two of his own soldiers when it was hardest to give. The irony is total, and it is not the kind that makes you smile. The cruelty of it is sharpened by how wrong he was on the merits. Combat fatigue is not a moral failing, and it is not cowardice. It is what happens to an ordinary human nervous system when it is held too long, under a strain it was never built to carry, and it strikes brave men and frightened men alike, very often the ones who have already endured the most, the ones who had been at the front longest, and asked least to be sent back. Patton, who prided himself on understanding soldiers better than anyone alive, had run face first into the limit of his own creed. He could see with perfect clarity that the failure of a beaten army was the fault of its leaders, and he could not, standing in that hospital tent, see that the collapse of a single shaking soldier in front of him might be no failure at all. It was the same blind spot the Germans had, simply pointed in a different direction, and it nearly cost him everything he had built. It nearly ended him. When word reached Eisenhower, he was furious, and Patton was forced to apologize, to the men, to the medical staff, and to assembled representatives of his troops, and he was held out of the center of the war for the better part of a year, sidelined while lesser commanders moved up the ladder he had expected to climb. The thing did not stay quiet either. Months later, a newspaper columnist back home got hold of the story and laid it in front of the American public, and the uproar that followed, the angry letters, the questions in Congress, the open talk of stripping him of his command for good, very nearly finished the job that Eisenhower's private fury had only started. He was, for that long stretch, a general in disgrace, kept around mostly because the Allies had discovered he was useful as a decoy, a famous name they could let the Germans worry about, while the real plans formed elsewhere. They handed him the nominal command of an army group that existed mainly on paper and radio traffic, parked it in England across the Channel from the narrowest stretch of coast at the Pas de Calais, and let German intelligence persuade itself that the great blow would fall there, under Patton, where the crossing was shortest. So the most feared American general spent the months before the liberation of France in command of a phantom, and the divisions the Germans held back to wait for him were divisions that never reached the beaches of Normandy in time to matter. The most aggressive battlefield commander the Americans had, spending the run-up to the invasion of France on the bench he had built for himself. Then they let him off it, and the full reply to the idea that Americans could not fight got written across an entire country. Guettar had been the first sentence of that reply. The rest of it was composed in the summer and autumn of 1944, when Patton took command of the Third Army in France and turned it loose after the breakout from Normandy. What the Third Army did in those months is one of the fastest sustained advances by a large force in the history of mechanized war. Patton drove his army across France at a speed that alarmed his own superiors, as much as it alarmed the enemy, slicing through and around German formations, refusing to halt, outrunning his own fuel supply because to Patton stopping felt more dangerous than overextending ever could. The aggression that had looked like vanity in a Tunisian command tent was now operating at the scale of a whole army, and it was tearing the German position in the west to ribbons. The breakout had a name, Operation Cobra, and once the American armor punched through the German line in Normandy that summer, Patton's Third Army poured into the gap and fanned out across France faster than headquarters could keep track of it. His columns covered ground so quickly that the supply trains could not keep up, and the maps at higher command went stale almost as fast as they could be drawn. Towns that had braced for months more of occupation found themselves liberated in an afternoon by tank columns that did not stop to celebrate. Whole regions of France came back into Allied hands in the time it had once taken to plan a single set-piece attack, and Patton kept demanding more road and more fuel and more speed, certain that every mile he took cheaply now was a mile he would not have to buy in blood later. In August, the chance came to trap an entire German army near a town called Falaise, with Patton's forces driving up from the south to slam the pocket shut, and Patton, smelling the kill, wanted to push further north and seal it tight. He was held back at the boundary by the caution of the command above him, and through the gap that stayed open longer than it should have, a good part of the trapped German force slipped away to fight another day. Thousands of men, and the cadres of divisions that would have to be beaten all over again in the months to come. Patton never forgave the hesitation. And he had a point. His entire method rested on the conviction that you never hand a beaten enemy time to breathe. And twice in that campaign, at Falaise and soon afterward at the empty fuel pumps, the war taught him in person what caution costs. When his tanks finally rolled to a stop in the early autumn, it was not because the Germans had checked them. It was because the gasoline had run out, and the men sat in their idle vehicles in Lorraine, cursing, while the enemy was handed the time to recover defenses that a few more days of fuel might have spared them. There followed the grinding, costly fight for the old fortress city of Metz, with its ring of stone forts dug into the hills around the town, the unglamorous side of war that the legend also tends to skip, where Patton's army spent weeks learning again that a determined enemy in good ground charges a heavy price and pays it back slowly. And then came the German army's last great gamble, the surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes that history remembers as the Battle of the Bulge, and with it, Patton's single most remarkable feat. As the German attack tore a hole in the American line and surrounded a division at the crossroads town of Bastogne, Patton did something his fellow generals had told him flatly could not be done in the time available. At a tense command conference at Verdun, with the map showing the German penetration deepening by the hour, Eisenhower asked him how soon he could turn north and strike, and Patton answered that he could attack within a couple of days. The other men in the room mostly took it for bluster, because the staff work alone, the orders, the routes, the fuel, the timing, looked like a week's labor on its own. An army that is locked in combat facing one direction cannot simply turn and march off in another. It has to break contact under fire without coming apart, reverse the entire flow of its own supply, and send tens of thousands of men and vehicles down iced single-lane roads in the dead of winter, without the whole machine grinding into a frozen jam miles deep. Patton took a large part of his army, already in battle facing east, pulled it out, wheeled it 90 degrees, and drove it north, through foul weather, to smash into the flank of the German offensive, breaking through to the trapped men at Bastogne within days. The men who could not fight, in the German telling of early 1943, had become the spearhead of the armies that broke open Germany itself. There is a famous, faintly absurd detail from that winter that captures him perfectly. With his army straining north and the skies socked in under cloud that kept the Allied air forces grounded and useless, Patton ordered his chief chaplain to compose a prayer for clear weather, had it printed and handed out to the entire army, and then waited for God and the meteorologists to sort it out between them. The weather cleared. The aircraft flew. Patton, a man who could blaspheme the paint off a wall, gave the chaplain a medal. Make of that what you like. But a commander who will pray for flying weather, and then drive a tank army 90 degrees through a blizzard, to rescue a surrounded town, is not a man with much patience for being told a thing cannot be done. This was the deeper meaning of the necktie fines, the theatrical revolvers, and the relentless visibility. Patton had never believed for one moment that courage was the American soldier's problem. which is exactly why he never wasted any effort trying to fix the courage. He fixed the leadership, the discipline, and the belief. And then he aimed the result at the enemy and pushed the accelerator to the floor. The Germans had built an entire doctrine on the idea that their enemies were inferior by nature, an idea that felt powerful and turned out to be a blindfold. Patton built his whole life on the opposite idea, that ordinary men, properly led and made to believe in themselves, will do extraordinary and terrible things, and that the only real job of a commander is to supply the leadership and the belief, and then have the sense to get out of the way of what those men become. You can see the entire argument compressed into a single comparison. Fredendall had the same soldiers Patton had, the identical men, drawn from the same towns, and trained in the same camps, and under one of them they broke at Kasserine, and under the other, they shattered a veteran Panzer Division at Guettar a few weeks later. The rifles were the same. The courage was the same. The only thing that changed was the quality of the mind in command, and that one change reversed the result completely. That is the whole indictment of the German theory, and the whole vindication of Patton's. Sitting side by side in two battles fought a few weeks and a few miles apart by the very same young men. The Germans, staring at the rubble of Kasserine, had drawn a permanent conclusion about the raw material of the American army. The raw material had been sound the whole time. What it had been waiting for was someone worth following into the fire. There is a harder and more honest postscript to all of this, and a history channel that wants to be trusted ought to tell it, rather than leave you with a clean statue. Patton's contempt for the Nazi idea of a master race was real, and it was total. He thought the doctrine of inborn superiority was not only evil but stupid, a way of blinding yourself to the enemy in front of you. And the war proved him right about that in the most expensive way imaginable. But Patton was not a tidy hero, and the same man who saw straight through the German myth on the battlefield stumbled badly once the shooting stopped. As a military governor in occupied Germany after the war, he was slow and openly reluctant about removing former Nazis from the machinery of local administration, on the practical sounding grounds that they were the people who knew how to keep the lights on and the trains moving. He made public comparisons between Nazi Party membership and ordinary political affiliation that were, at the most generous reading, staggeringly tone-deaf, and considerably worse than that taken at face value, given what the party in question had just spent 12 years doing to the world. It cost him his command. He was removed from the head of the Third Army in the autumn of 1945. In December of that year, riding in a car near Mannheim, he was badly injured in a low-speed collision on a quiet road, and he died not long after. A soldier who had ridden through 2 world wars and survived being shot, killed in the end by an ordinary traffic accident, his war finished and his reputation already sliding into the strange, permanent argument it has occupied ever since. He was, to put it plainly, a genuinely great battlefield commander, and a genuinely flawed man, both at the same time and in the same body. And any version of him that sands away one of those truths to make the other shine brighter is selling you a cartoon instead of a person. Hold both. They are both real. But on the one specific question this story has been circling from the start, he was simply right, and the German command that sneered at the American soldier in early 1943 was simply wrong, and the bill for being wrong was paid first by the crews of the 10th Panzer Division, burning in a valley near Guettar, and in the end, by the entire regime that had carefully taught itself to mistake its enemies for cowards. Because that was always the real lesson, and it reaches a long way past one battle in Tunisia. The German verdict failed not because the German army was weak. It was anything but weak, and it would go on killing with terrible efficiency for 2 more years. The verdict failed because the German mind was closed. They looked at a beaten, badly led, green enemy, and saw a permanent truth about that enemy's character, when all they were actually looking at was one bad afternoon and one worse general. They confused a single moment for a final judgment, and they built their plans on that confusion, and then they sent a veteran armored division to act on it and got it shot to pieces. They would make the same mistake on a far larger scale against the Soviets, and it would help bury them. That was the hidden flaw built into the whole machine. An army that tells itself the enemy is inferior by birth has quietly disabled its own ability to learn. Every surprise gets explained away. Every enemy success becomes a fluke, an accident of numbers, a thing that will surely correct itself next time. The German command did exactly this with the Americans. deciding that Guettar was bad luck rather than a warning. And it did the same thing on a vastly greater scale in the East, where the conviction that they were fighting subhuman opponents helped march them into a war that swallowed their army whole. Contempt feels like strength from the inside. It reads as confidence, as clarity, as hard-headed realism. In practice, it is one of the most expensive things a military can let itself feel, because it blinds you to precisely the information you most need in order to survive. Patton's real advantage over the men who sneered at his soldiers was never that he was kinder than they were. It was that he was paying attention, and they had decided they no longer needed to. Patton, for all his flaws, never made that particular error about his own men. He looked at the same beaten, written-off soldiers the Germans had dismissed, and he saw an army that had simply never been handed a reason to believe in itself. So he spent 2 weeks and an unreasonable quantity of neckties handing them that reason. And 1 month later, a veteran Panzer Division paid for the difference in burning steel. The American soldier never lacked courage. He lacked, for one bad season, leadership worthy of the courage he already carried. A loud man with ivory revolvers and an absurd obsession with chin straps gave that leadership back to him in the space of a few weeks, and the entire rest of the war turned, in a sense, into the long and bloody process of the German command discovering exactly how badly it had misread the men it had called soft. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is for. So thank you for watching. Tell us in the comments whether you think it was Patton's discipline that turned the Second Corps around, or whether the real credit belongs to the soldiers who actually held those hills at Guettar with guns in their hands. If you got something out of the story, the like and the subscribe genuinely do help us keep making these. And there are a great many more on the way. We will see you in the next one.